sure if Pastor's going to say anything, probably will, but I am thankful for Seth Hamilton. I was thinking tonight that he's one of the huge reasons that I'm at Friendship Baptist Church today. He was one of the first friends that I made in school, and one of the most influential friends that I had in school. He had a very imposing presence, and I was his roommate for some months, and continued to be an influence in my life, not only physically but also spiritually as well. And I'm very thankful for that, and I've respected him from a distance, not on purpose from a distance, but anyway, wish it could be a little closer, but he's down in North Carolina, but thankful to have him with us tonight. 357, create in me a clean heart, my Father. 357. I came to the Lord with my heart full of sin, empty of purpose and troubled within. My flesh had the victory, my heart sought release. Lord, wilt thou cleanse me and grant me thy peace? Create in me a clean heart, my Father, renew a right spirit in me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation. May Christ be seen in me. I cried to the Savior, forgive me, I pray. He granted cleansing and sins fell away. My bondage was ended, my heart was set free. Lord, nevermore may I wander from thee. Create in me a clean heart, my Father, renew a right spirit in me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation. May Christ be seen in me.
I will say that because of Seth, Wes is not half the man he used to be. I'll let him explain that one to you, okay? And that's a compliment, by the way. It's a joy to have Seth and Jill here and the children. And I know that it's very obvious who Seth got his build from. It is hard, though, to watch your son develop gray hair. Then you know you're really getting old. That is me. So I'm excited to have him here, partly to not only to preach the word, but also to be able to share a little bit of what he does. And the more I hear, just the more impressed I am with the opportunities he has in the ministry that God has given him there in the chaplaincy. And so I'm thankful that he could be here, and I hope it'll give all of us a greater burden for praying for them in the ministry and just following their ministry. We're going to, as their sending church, we're going to get a picture of them up on our missionary board, and they are planning on sending out a letter on some basis and just keeping us informed and helping us to pray more effectively for them. So, Seth, would you come?
There were so many less kind things that Wes could have said. We were roommates for actually close to 2 years. And there was one year there was myself, another guy named Jason Miller, and Wes, and the three of us were at one of the faculty members had an upstairs that they had remodeled into an apartment. And so the three of us they didn't have enough housing on campus, and so the three of us were sharing that room. And I was the only one with a vehicle. And so we were never, the three of us, there was always one of us that couldn't get out the door quick. We were always just sliding into class, like just last second. And sometimes. But that is something I did get from my dad. But we broke a few speed limits sometimes trying to make it to school. So anyway, I will tell you that I have found that the two, can I just put this over since I'm technically, okay. The two most difficult places to preach are in a church where a good chunk of the faculty from your seminary are sitting. I had that experience last year, and that was very nerve-wracking because, of course, they remembered all the tests I didn't do very well on, and you're a little worried about, like, now in the Greek, and one of them's like, not quite, Seth. Remember those Greek grades, And so that was nerve-wracking. And the other one is your home church where you grew up, because many of you remember me before I was in college and before I was in the military, and a number of you have had significant impact on my life, but also probably remember, in fact, Art mentioned that he said, I remember when the Hamilton Rugrats first came, and I was thinking, please don't, because you remember all of the mistakes and the teenage problems and everything else, and I know you all are very gracious, and I've seen that over the years, for many years, but still in the back of your mind, you're like, are they thinking, Seth, just sit down, But anyway, it is a little nerve-wracking, I will admit. My dad asked me to share a little bit about our ministry, and it really is our ministry as a family. While I'm the one that wears the uniform, it's been a family ministry in many, many ways. Most of you probably know, but I went on active duty with the military in 2015, Army as a chaplain. I was in the reserves for 9 years before that, while I was in seminary, and then while I was pastoring in Wisconsin. And so we first went to Fort Stewart, Georgia. We were there for 4 years. I was in 2 different units there. The second unit, I was in Europe with them for about 2.5 months. Came back, we reset, retrained, and then we went to Korea for 9 months. Many of you remember when Jill was up here for about a year. That was while I was in Korea, and I came back for a very short time for Gunner's birth, actually. I got some leave to come back for that, and then turned right about around and went back to Korea for another couple months, and then, another 3 or 4 or 5 months. And then we took a short 6-month move to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and then for a captain's career course, which supposedly prepares you to be a major. And then we went to Fort Bragg, which is where we've been since. So we got there in July of 19, and we have been there since then. So we're coming up on 4 years there. We've had an unusual amount of stability, actually, for Army life, and we're very thankful for that. The last several years at Fort Bragg have been very rewarding ministry, as was the ministry at Fort Stewart. When I got to Fort Bragg, I was assigned to a psychological operations battalion, which is part of the special operations community. Very much about messaging, and in a very hostile environment, it would be deception. So if you've read perhaps like in World War II, some of the different campaigns they ran where they threw a dead body out of a plane, and a guy was loaded with a bunch of classified papers, and they made sure that it floated into the shore where the Germans were, and the Germans found this body, and they're like, all these secret documents, and they were misinformation. That's an extreme version of what these guys do. Now, interestingly, a lot of what they do now is much more focused on the social media. They can actually track trends across a particular location, geographic region, a particular country, and then they're able to actually insert in different ways messaging through different means to try and sway the population of that particular region or country. Sometimes it's in a positive sense, and it's with our allies where they're trying to communicate to the country, the allied country, the danger that is being posed by a particular group or ideology. And other times, it's in a hostile environment, and so they're trying to potentially deceive an adversary or something like that. So I was with them, and that was interesting because they're just by the nature of their job, they're very much in the headspace, and they really they are always they can't turn it off, right? So it's not like they go to work and all of a sudden they're these psyopers and they're trying to trick the enemy and they're trying to message and everything, and then they come out and they go home or they're with their friends and they turn it off. They actually select for personality types that have an affinity for it anyway, and so they kind of try to psyop everybody, and it's a very interesting environment. It was very unique, not something I'd ever experienced before. Fortunately, the one thing they do enjoy is talking about what they do, and so they were able to kind of explain some of it. And so after a while, I started to notice things. I'd be like, "Are you doing whatever?" And oh yeah, sorry. They would dial it down, and we'd have some conversations. Made some good friends. Was able to minister to a number of people. But where we found that our ministry really, in that capacity, in that particular unit, where we really saw the most fruit, was with the support elements, right? So you have your special operations, we would call what they call operators. So the guys that go through some sort of selection, an extended training, and they graduate and they are officially part of special operations. Well, then there's all the sustainers and support that they need, like chaplains and mechanics and cooks and HR people and people that fix radios and all these different things, supply. And so those they pull out of the conventional forces and they augment, and they're assigned within the unit. And many of them in that particular unit were young single soldiers. They're living in the barracks anywhere from 18 to 23, 24. And they were somewhat isolated because they weren't really on the inside with the operators, but because they're assigned to these units, they don't get to hang out with the conventional forces really, like the 82nd Airborne and some of the other conventional forces there at Fort Bragg. And so as I began to try and build some relationships, Jill and I became burdened to start a Bible study in the barracks on Tuesday nights. And so we'd cook a home-cooked meal, and we'd bring it in, and we invite anybody in the barracks who wanted to come. And we were averaging anywhere between 50 and 20 single soldiers every week. And it was an amazing opportunity. We did that for almost 2 full years. We went through a good chunk of the book of Genesis. We went through the book of Mark, expositional Bible study all the way through the book of Mark. Went through the book of James. And it was amazing to see the change that took place in some of these young people's lives. We also learned a lot about the brokenness of our culture in dealing with these young soldiers. For the first several months, Jill was not able to come because of the age of our kids and nursing and some other things. And so finally, after I think we'd been going a little over 6 months, Jill was able to come. And by this point, I built some great relationships with these young men and ladies. Actually, there were some young single females as well. And but in this particular one, none of the girls were there. It was just guys. There were about 11, 12 guys in the room. And we were going through the book of Genesis, if I recall. We'd finished James, we started Genesis, and we were getting into some of the passages that really deal with fathers and parents and husband and those kind of things. And what that looks like biblically. And that sparked a very, very interesting conversation. And someone kind of half-jokingly said, well, you're our dad now. And, I kind of, laughed it off, kind of joke. Because I assumed he was completely joking. But then one of the older young men there, who's mid-20s, and he was actually getting ready to leave soon, and he'd had come into my office actually a couple of times. We had some very, very serious conversations. He was realizing the futility of the life he was living. He was living a very immoral life and was realizing that it didn't satisfy. And so we had talked, and it was interesting talking to him because he said, I want to find someone that, has, as he began to gain some depth in his life and realize that there's more to life than all these very temporal pleasures and going to bars and hooking up and all these different kinds of things. And he said, but I can't find any girls that, have a similar outlook on life, And I asked him, I said, well, where are you looking? And he looked at me funny, and I said, well, where are you trying to meet these girls? And he said, well, bars and parties and things like that. I was like, well, the girl you've described that you're looking for, do you think she would be at that party? And he had this like aha moment. And he goes, no, probably not. I said, well, where would you find them, do you think? And he thought about it for a minute, and he was like, probably like churches and like maybe like volunteer opportunities and things like that. And I said, probably, And the amazing thing was, here he is, he's 25 years old, and it never occurred to him to even look anywhere else. So anyway, this young man, Patrick was his name, he got very serious. He looked over at me and said, no, you don't understand. He said, you're the closest thing any of us have ever had to a dad. You're our dad now. And Jill started crying. And I didn't know what to do with that, and I kind of asked, I said, so, why would you say that? He said, well, I never knew my dad. He's like, I've got 2 half-brothers. We grew up together, but none of us had the same dad. and so I kind of asked a few questions, and they went around the room, and out of the 12 people sitting in that room, 2 of them came from what we would consider a traditional home, where their mom and their father were married and had stayed married throughout their childhood. Now, neither of those, as I kind of probed those ones later, neither of those relationships and those families were healthy by any means. One was a retired sergeant major who was violent both verbally and physically in the home, and it was a very negative situation. The other one was one of these situations where they just never gotten around to really getting divorced, and it was a very ugly marriage, but they just had never gotten divorced. They still lived in the same house, but it was fighting and just nothing what we would consider a normal biblical home. I would take that, thank you. So Jared's one of the other reasons that makes me nervous coming here, because he knows probably more about me than even Wes does, given that we but of course I know probably about as much as about him, so it's mutual blackmail. I will say it's interesting coming in here, and you don't realize that you're getting older until you look around and you see faces that are kind of familiar, but they're not, until you realize they're the kids of the people your age, And you're like, oh, okay, yes, I am getting old, older. But anyway, so we realized out of these 12 young people sitting in this room, none of them knew what a normal, traditional, biblical home even looked like. No idea, no concept. And so we were able to just walk them through these biblical truths that they'd never heard before. It was amazing when we got to the flood in Genesis and walking them through. And I was so thankful for the emphasis that this church put on a good understanding of creation and the flood and how that plays into countering the theory of evolution, because I was able to just walk them through some of this stuff and say all these things that they say prove evolution don't. And there's actually a very valid alternative explanation in a flood. And once again, it was one of those moments that was so cool, because you just saw light bulbs going on in their head. Just, oh, wow, the Bible's real, like it's true. And that was a unique concept for so many of them. So anyway, so we did that for 2 years, and I got promoted and moved out of that unit into another unit. And so for about a year, we had kind of a little bit of a break. My job was kind of a 9 to 4 job, 8 to 4 job, and it was working in the the office of the chaplain that was over a good chunk of special operations, not all of them, but it's called First Special Forces Command. So Civil Affairs, PSYOP, and Special Forces all fall under this, a 2-star command, so it's equivalent of an Army division. And so I was working in his office and kind of waiting for the whole COVID thing to die down and see what happened there. And so I was there for about a year. And so we were actually able to focus really for that year because we thought we were going to move. I had stepped out of the ministries I was involved in a chapel there. And then because that was the Bible study was in the barracks, and the barracks were assigned to that unit I'd been in. I couldn't really continue that ministry. And so we took a step back and we were able to focus a little bit on the kids and on our family and just kind of making sure we were all doing well. We have the Lord's blessed us with an excellent church there in the Fort Bragg area, and so we've all really grown a lot over the last year and a half. And then in January, I was reassigned to the Sustainment Brigade in the 82nd Airborne Division. So the Sustainment Brigade essentially provides a lot of the support element for the combat, for the infantry and the field artillery and some of the other what we call combat arms. And so we have mechanics and we have cooks and we have riggers, right? Riggers are the guys who pack parachutes. So I have about 400 riggers in my brigade, which is a very stressful job for them. An Army rigger has to jump his own parachutes once a quarter, right? So, which if you're a good rigger is probably very reassuring. If you're not, you feel like you're playing Russian roulette because you don't get to pick the parachute, right? They have to pack 15 chutes a day, and so somebody will walk up randomly, stick their hand in their crate, pull out a parachute, hand it to him, and say, "You're jumping this." So it's a good way to keep them honest. Which we're all very thankful for because we then have to use we don't get to pick which chute we get either. So we want them to do a good job. So anyway, I'm in the Sustainment Brigade now. And a lot of the last 6 months has been very, very focused on just learning a new job because it's a different level. I'm now supervising 5 chaplains that are at the battalion level. And that has been a unique experience. I'm responsible for a certain portion of their training. As well as coordinating the different efforts and coverage so that we make sure that we don't have soldiers going without some sort of chaplain support, some sort of chaplain connection on a regular basis. And so that's been a unique experience and doing it in a different environment than I've done it before. So I've been focused on that very much. A lot of counseling. So the way the division works, we have what we call the IBCTs, infantry brigade combat teams. Sorry. So we have 3 airborne infantry brigade combat teams, and the 82nd Airborne is on it's the contingency force. So if something goes off in the world really bad at short notice, they send the 82nd if they're going to send conventional forces. They were the first guys sent over to Poland when Russia invaded Ukraine. There, at one point, things were getting a little out of hand in the Middle East several years ago, and so they sent a brigade, and they were in Kuwait and other places up into the Middle East. Most recently, we were put on alert. We thought we were going to Sudan, and then they decided to send in special operations, and they, as you probably saw in the news, they got the embassy personnel out, but there was a possible plan that we would jump a brigade of the 82nd into Sudan, seize an airfield, and then go get the embassy people, bring them to that, and then fly them out as well as any other American citizens that needed a way out. So we were looking at that. Fortunately, that we didn't have to deal with that. It didn't happen, and so we're kind of back to waiting for the next time something kicks off in the world, which could happen at any time. Let's see here. So our current ministries, we have a young couple we started to, actually, they met in our Bible study. And they started dating, and they came to us and said, "We have no clue how to do this, and could you guys help us?" And they were asking for premarital counseling. They didn't know what to call it, but that's what it was. And so for about 6 months, they would come over on Monday nights to our house, and we did a premarital counseling. And it was bite-sized. It was they had no foundation whatsoever. They were just very, very baby believers. And so we would just little bit at a time, just little truths of Scripture, just walking them through. What does this mean? We give them homework, and they would go home and they would discuss it, and they'd work through it, and they'd come back the next week, and so some of it was just the basics of communication and things like that, but other things were roles, biblical roles. What does that look like? They're both in the military, and she's wanting to have a career, but also recognizing she wants to be a mom, and she wants to have both, and is this really possible, especially dual military? And so we helped them perform their wedding back in, was it February or was it November? January? Okay, so I performed their wedding in January, and they've continued to come over, and as things pretty regularly, between their schedule and our schedule, it's not every week, it's about every other week, maybe every 3 weeks, depending on schedule, but they've been coming over on Monday nights, and we'll sit down and say, all right, how's it going? And they'll say, well, we had this, it went really well, and then we had this thing, we had this fight, or we had whatever, and you help them work through like how to handle disagreements and things like that, biblically, right? And so that's been a lot of fun. We've gotten to be good friends with them. We also have a young chaplain and his wife that's one of the ones I supervise, and he is a very conservative Presbyterian. He's not Baptist, but when I began talking with him, I realized he was pretty worn down. He's a very good preacher and minister, and he had been really pouring into his soldiers, but not focusing on his walk with the Lord enough. And so we talked a little bit. I challenged him. I said, hey, you can't minister out of an empty glass. You can't pour out without somebody pouring in, and it needs to be Christ. Like, you need to focus on your relationship with Christ. And so about the same time I started talking with him, he had a soldier pass away, and just not anything military related, just some foolishness on a Friday night. They had alcohol, and then they decided to do some grappling, and apparently got out of hand, and this soldier got put in a chokehold, and it wasn't released soon enough, and he died. And so then shortly, about a week and a half after, the same company, so a company of about 150 or so, lost another soldier within a very, very short time. And on top of that, his wife went through a miscarriage at the same time. And so they were really, really, the Lord was really putting them through it at that moment. And he definitely felt a little bit like Job. And we were able to minister to them and encourage them. And I met with him middle of the last week. And he said, Holly and I, that's his wife's name, we really took what you said about focusing our relationship with the Lord to heart, and I want to tell you it has helped us so much. He said, can we start meeting like every week and talking more? I need this. And so that was encouraging. We're also going to start a ministry here in a couple of weeks. We're calling it Marriage Mondays. And it's kind of an outgrowth of that first couple that we were doing some discipleship and premarital counseling with, and now it's for young couples who are newlyweds. And it's a little bit of Bible study, a little bit of just kind of a conversation of what's going on in your life, like what's not working, where are you sensing the biggest struggles, and letting them kind of work through things as peers, but then kind of help shape the conversation and direct it through the Word of God. And so we're looking forward to starting that here in another couple of weeks. I've also been asked to start a men's ministry on Fort Bragg. And we were supposed to start back in March or April, and we were about 2 weeks out from starting, and every other person that I had asked to help with it came down on orders to leave in June. And so we kind of had to put the brakes on it until I can build a team, because of the schedule that we have as chaplains, it's not like a pastor where you're normally there and occasionally you're gone. It's more like sometimes you're there, sometimes you're not. You don't always have a lot of warning. And so you need enough people that when one or two people get pulled out at short notice or have to go train or whatever, that there's still enough people to lead the group. And so we're working on rebuilding that. But I look forward to seeing how God is going to use that as well. So what I'll do is I'll take a couple questions. If you have questions about the ministry or what we're doing, I'll take a few before I get into the message. I promise I'm not going to keep you here super late. But I do want to give you the chance, especially since we would we would ask that you would pray for us. Because of being in the military, obviously my salary is paid and we're very well taken care of and we're very thankful for that. But we definitely covet prayers. And it's something we've started to realize just in the last year or two, that chaplains sometimes get a little isolated in the military because it's such an immersion experience that you can get, you need the fellowship, you need the prayers, you need the encouragement. And so we're reaching out to a couple of churches that we've had relationships over the years and asking them if they would take us on as missionaries, not financially, but through prayer. So that being said, does anyone have any questions? Jerry.
How do you deal with the government's push for wokeness, and how does that affect you and what you're trying to do?
Well, the wise as serpents and innocent as doves, very important. There's a lot of protection for chaplains, honestly, because we have an endorsing agency. It's similar to denomination. It doesn't have to be a denomination, but something like that. Government looks on it like a denomination. And actually, that's the reason I'm up here is I'm attending my endorsers annual training over in this year. Faith Baptist Bible College in Ankeny is hosting it. But anyway, that's my endorser. And so they have rules, right? And for their chaplains, and you have to follow those rules. If you violate those rules, you lose your endorsement. Well, the DOD has signed off on these endorsers, right? These guys this is a legitimate faith group. We recognize it. Excuse me. And so they can't order me to do anything that my endorser says I can't do, because if they did that, then I would lose my endorsement. And so it's a catch-22, right? Essentially, so in my capacity as an ordained minister, FBF outranks the DOD. So that's not quite accurate, but it's about how it works. So I have to obey God rather than man, essentially. And so they recognize that, which is fortunate. Now, there are people that don't like the fact that that is the way it is, and I wouldn't be surprised if sometime in the coming years someone tries to change that, but that is the current situation. That being said, you still have to be very careful. And there's certain things you say to make it clear that this is my opinion, this is my belief, this isn't necessarily endorsed by the DOD or by the Army. But so it is challenging, right? And there are times when I just have had to say, I can't be involved in that. I can't do that. Sometimes it's taken well, other times it's not. But you have to leave those kind of things in the Lord's hands. So anyway, get asked that a lot, and it's a valid question. I think the higher up in rank you get, probably, the more challenging it would be. When you're down at the battalion and even the brigade level, they're very much worried about making sure that their soldiers can survive, right? And there's the aspect of, hey, can you shoot straight? Can you shoot, move, and communicate, right? From the training perspective, but then on the other hand, are they healthy, right? Are they physically healthy? Are they spiritually healthy? Are they mentally healthy? And the chaplain it's well recognized, the chaplain plays a very major role in that, and has for really the entire history of the United States Army. And so as long as you're not deliberately kicking a hornet's nest, and as long as you are good at what you do, right, most battalion commanders don't really care. They want their soldiers to survive. So as long as they see that you are aiding in that survivability, they're very happy to have you. So, certain amount of pragmatism there. Yeah, Tim.
You mentioned that you have 5 chaplains that kind of receive. Are they all Protestant chaplains? Or?
Yes, currently. There's a pretty broad spectrum of Protestant in there. But yeah, they are all Protestant. When I was in C4, actually, realized that at some point I would probably be supervising someone that there would be a conflict there, because I sincerely believe that what they are preaching is not going to send people to heaven, right? And so if I were to in any way enable them from a pastoral perspective, right? Hey, let me help you get better at public speaking, at preaching. Let me help you with your counseling, something like that. In my conscience, I couldn't do that. And so, but one of the things that we're required, that one of the, I'm forgetting the right word. So the chaplain corps has a dual responsibility. It's to perform or to provide, right? So I perform services, right, as a independent Baptist chaplain, right? As an ordained minister by this church, I perform services, right? And I do those strictly within the confines of my faith and practice. However, I have Catholics, I have Muslims, I have Jews within my formation. Our Constitution guarantees them the right to worship according to their faith beliefs. Now, I'm not going to do a service for them. I can't, not only just because of my conscience, but also because I don't meet the requirements, right? So in that case, my responsibility is to say, hey, there is a Jewish chaplain over there. He does services on Saturdays, and here is his number. If you will call him, he will coordinate to get you there, right? And sometimes the way we explain it is it's almost like you have a job as a staff officer, like every other officer in the United States Army. You have certain requirements, not all of which you agree with, right? But it's not that and then you have your job as a minister and as a pastor. And so in the case of like a Catholic chaplain or a Muslim chaplain or something like that, what I would do is I would look around the post and I would find someone of that faith group that is of a senior rank to them, and I'd say, hey, could you take them on as your mentor? I'd still write their review, but I will be heavily informed by your opinion based on your development of them. Now, from an Army officer perspective, I still have a responsibility, right? But that is about understanding of the staff processes, right? And that's a different function than supervising them as a minister in their faith group. If that makes sense. It's like I said, like I mentioned with Jerry, it's a fine line sometimes, and you have to weigh those as you encounter it. You really have to look scripturally at it and say, okay, where's the line here? And I try to usually stay a couple inches back from it because sometimes it's not clear where it is. So you just, you know what, I cross that line. I don't think I can. I think I'm getting a little too close there. Let's go ahead and find an alternative. So one of the cool things has been I've never had a soldier come in from any faith group. And I always tell them, like, look, guys, you know, I'm a Christian chaplain. I mean, I got the cross right here. And specifically, I'm Baptist, right? And so I believe the Bible. I believe what it says. And so whatever I say is going to agree with what the Bible says. I may not quote a passage at you. I may not quote a verse. But whatever I say, whatever principles, it's going to come out of here. Is that okay? Never had anybody say no. So 9 times out of 10, the reason they're in there is because they've met you and they say, kind of seems like he's figured something out, like something's going on right for him. And he seems like he might be trustworthy. And so it really is very much based on the relationship that you develop with your soldiers. And then from there, it evolves into something more of a spiritual, has some spiritual depth to it. So over the years, on several occasions now, I've had soldiers get in contact with me years later and say, hey, I just want to let you know I got saved, I got baptized, I'm back in church. And I know it didn't seem like it at the time, but your ministry played a big role in that. And so you don't realize sometimes you're watering until later, and sometimes you never find out. Just recently, this is one of those ones you're like, I didn't really think that was ever going to happen. You know, a soldier that when I was in Korea that I spent quite a bit of time with, just mostly friendly time, like not like any spiritual depth or anything like that. But he was, I wouldn't say he was a troublemaker, but he was rough. He was rough in the edges. He's from He's from the Bronx, and everything that goes with that. Very stereotypical Italian from the Bronx. And so he got out. He did his 4 or 6 years or whatever, got out, and decided he was going to be a rapper. And so he starts doing all this stuff, and you'd see his stuff pop up on Facebook, and I just feel like, Richie, man, I hope you don't end up in a box, because it was getting pretty crazy there for a while. And then, and I mean, we're talking doing rap music while smoking drugs, and like it was about that, and gangster lifestyle, all this stuff. And about 3, 4, maybe 5 months ago, his girlfriend passed away. And I just reached out to him and said, hey, I can't imagine what you're going through, but if you need to talk, I'm here. And he just responded, hey, you don't know how much that means. Thank you. Never contacted me. And then about a month ago, all of a sudden, all these posts start popping up on his Facebook page about how, God can heal your life and Jesus is the answer. And so finally, I messaged him just a couple days ago, and I was like, hey, how you doing? And he goes, I'm doing so much better. I just want you to know it's amazing what God does. And I understand, you talk about rough around the edges, right? These guys, there's times when you're having a spiritual conversation with someone and they don't even know that they're using profanity in the conversation, So it was kind of one of those messages where I'm like, okay, I think I know where you're going here because I know you, but there's a lot of things wrong with what you just said. But I see where you're going, and the Lord is working in his heart, and those are always really exciting opportunities and experiences. So maybe 1 or 2 more questions if we have anybody. Anybody else? All right, let's go ahead and look at the book of Galatians. We're going to look at Galatians chapter 6. When I spoke about Matthew, he's the chaplain that I am supervising, and I was encouraging him that he needed to make sure that when he, as he was seeking to be spiritually refreshed and restored, that he makes sure that the primary focus of that was Christ. Because anything else apart from Christ, right? It's not that certain behaviors and habits aren't healthy, and right. But if they are separate from Christ, if you do not have Christ but you have these habits, well, they might get you through life. They're simply a coping mechanism. And so when I encouraged him to really focus his, make that the primary focus, and it maybe some sort of hobby that helped him kind of just relax and restore a little bit, that should be secondary and it should be kind of an outflow of his walk with Christ. I wasn't primarily saying that just as somebody who has read his Bible and grew up in a good church, but someone who personally had experienced it in a relatively recent time. About a little over 2 years ago, one of the guys in our church, who's my age, he's prior service. He was a Green Beret for about 13 years and spent most of that time in the Middle East. And he reached out to me and several other men in our church, and he just basically said, look, I know I'm supposed to be a godly husband, I'm supposed to be a godly dad, but I don't think I'm doing a very good job of it, and I'm not quite sure how to. And his name's Wes, and so Wes reached out to me, and I didn't really know him at this point, but he knew I was a chaplain, and he figured, well, so he reached out to me, the pastor, several other guys, and he just said, hey, can we start some sort of Bible study? It's kind of in the middle of COVID, and let's start something. And so several of us agreed, like, yeah, we need this. And so we started meeting every week usually virtually. We'd meet for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours sometimes. And it was Sunday nights because we weren't having Sunday night services. And we began to study through the Bible and work through some of these different truths about being a godly man and what does that mean. And what I was not willing to really share with him or anybody else at this point is I was not doing very well spiritually. I was struggling. The previous several years of ministry had been pretty rough. It had been hard. They've been draining. I hadn't always taken the time I should have in my relationship with the Lord, and my relationship with Him and my spiritual walk had suffered as a consequence. And so it was getting to the point where I didn't really want to. I kind of felt like avoiding my time with the Lord. prayer time and reading my Bible. And because, it kind of made me feel guilty and kind of made me feel like, hey, I'm just not making it. And I knew wasn't really meaningful. And so I wasn't about to tell anybody that, though, right? There's a lot of pride there. And so we were going through, and the Lord began to work in my heart. And these as time went on, the group kept dwindling because of schedules, and some guys just really weren't ready to dig in yet. They recognized they had a need, but hadn't really gotten to the point of urgency yet. And so, for whatever reason, originally we had 8 guys in the group. About 6 weeks in, we had 4 left, and we were working through this Bible study that we'd written ourselves. So it was a 4-week devotional, and each of us had taken a week and written a devotional on a particular topic, 5-6 devotionals on a particular topic. And so we're working through this. And I don't remember exactly all the details, but finally I got to the point where I was like, okay, I got to be honest with these guys, because we're not going to get anywhere if we're not, and I know I need it. But I was really nervous because I was afraid of how they would take it, that I would, they would, you're supposed to be the spiritual guy here, you're chaplain, and all this and the other, and all the lies you tell yourself, and Satan tells you. And so finally I was honest with them. I was like, guys, I'm not doing well. And I was really waiting for kind of the step back and the putting me at arm's length, and they didn't. And these 3 brothers said, what do you need from us? How can we help? And I said, well, I'll be honest with you. This may seem silly, but if you guys could just give me a call, just during the week, give me a call, see how I'm doing. Ask me how, did I have my time with the Lord? How'd the day go? And I said, I think it might help. And they were like, all right. Well, I honestly didn't expect them to call because of some previous experiences I had in some other situations. I really thought, yeah, they won't call, right? So Monday night, my phone rang, and it was my pastor. Well, it was my pastor. Your pastor kind of has to call you, right? Kind of his job. He gets paid to do this, right? And that's really what I thought. That's really what went through my mind. And so I was like, well, here we go. It's pastor. So he calls me. And so he encouraged me, he prayed with me, and it was refreshing, but once again, it was kind of one of those things where I was like, it's not, it's the pastor. Well, Tuesday night, I'm driving home from the barracks Bible study that I told you about, and I just pulled out onto the road to go off post. My phone rings, and I look at it, and it's Dwayne, and he's Wes, pastor, and then Dwayne and myself. Dwayne is a 61-year-old HVAC repairman and installer, right? Like he's the guy that's not a PK or in ministry, because Wes' dad was an evangelist and a pastor for many years, and then of course our pastor is the pastor, and so Dwayne was not the guy. I didn't know him very well at this point yet, and so I was kind of like, I don't know this guy, but he kind of came all across a little bit rough around the edges, and so he called me. He said, "How you doing?" Well, he called me. I said, "Dwayne, everything okay? What's going on?" He said, I'm calling you. You asked us to call you. And I literally was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I said, thank you. And so he said, I want to pray with you. So he prayed with me. He asked me how things were going, and we had a meeting. I thought, that was amazing. I can't believe that. So Wednesday afternoon, my phone rings, and it was Wes, different Wes. He, same thing. And I was like, well, that was interesting. I didn't know what to do with it. And it probably sounds a little silly, but I really didn't know what to do with it. And then Thursday, pastor called again. Friday, Dwayne called. Saturday, Wes called. And apparently they'd worked this out. All right, we're each going to take these 2 days of the week, and and they'd worked it out. And they did it all week long. Every single day they called me. And that was a different week than the previous months before. And so we went into our Bible study that week, and I just told him, I don't know what to do with that. Like, thank you, but and we began to realize that, and this could be a whole series of messages, so I won't get into all of it, but we began to realize that God didn't design us to fight the battles alone in our spiritual life. And it's very interesting when you look at the Ephesians chapter 6 and the armor of God and spiritual warfare, that it's in the context of the church, right? The book of Ephesians is about the church. And so, but our passage this morning really describes what these brothers did for me. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this tonight. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourselves, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another, for each shall bear his own load. When we look at this passage, what we find is that we have a problem, and it's this idea of restoring a brother, right? And Paul cites it here. And basically, he says, be careful, but this is something you need to be doing, right? And the problem he identifies here is that we have a lack of humility, and it interferes with the restoration of our fellow believers, right? Now, typically we start talking about pride, right? There's two ways you go about it, right? One is, well, everybody struggles with pride, you know? Like the second you start to feel like you're starting to get a handle on it, you realize you don't, because that's pride, you know? And so we kind of have this, revolving cyclical thing. And the other aspect, sometimes we talk about, the other way we kind of approach it sometimes is we basically deny goodness in ourselves, right? As though that's somehow humility. And that's really not what he's telling us to do here. And really what he's saying, look, stop worrying. Don't think about yourself so much, right? That's what real humility is, right? It's really not thinking about yourself at all, right? It's focusing on others. And that's what he's calling for us to do. He's basically telling us we have to humbly restore fellow believers who fall into sin. But if we don't do it humbly, we find a couple warnings about what happens. But I just want to kind of walk through this. And he sets the stage, and he gives us a command, right? And he says, brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. That's the command, right? And this is not an option, folks, right? Now, I started looking up the words on this passage, and it says if a man is overtaken means to be caught from behind, to be tripped up. Idea is someone who's running, and someone else comes up behind him, either knowing or unknowing, and trips him up, catches him, snares him, right? He says if you are overtaken, so caught, the idea would be someone is running the race, right? And they get tripped up. And he says in a trespass, all right? You guys know the term transgression. It means to miss the mark or to stumble over something by chance, right? If you miss the mark, the implication is normally you were aiming for it and you missed, right? Most of the time you aren't like, oh, there's the mark, right? It's right back there, but I'm going to shoot over. It's not what usually we're shooting for it and we miss, but the intent was there. And this passage really carries the idea that the person, it assumes them to be, it assumes that they're initially sincere in their faith, and their attempt was sincere, all right? It doesn't question their faith or their Christian walk, right? And I think, at least for me, my tendency when I see someone who's not doing well spiritually is to kind of question, did they really try? Did they really because when I look at my decisions, right, I can usually see where I go wrong. And so I look at someone else and I make a very similar assumption, and probably a little harsher than I am on myself, right? So I know when I know what's right and wrong, but do you ever wonder if maybe, yes, I recognize that I'm at a decision to do right or wrong. Sometimes I choose to do right, and sometimes I choose to do wrong. But did you ever think that maybe the wrong choice was made a little bit further back, You didn't realize you were necessarily making it, or it didn't seem like the wrong choice at the time. So that by the point you get to the actual choice, you're not really as right with God as you thought you were. Remember how David, we say, oh man, he sinned with Bathsheba. He killed Uriah. like, wow. But the passage is very specific when it says, in the time when kings went out to war. But he didn't go. Now, he probably seemed like he had a lot of good reasons for that. He wasn't a young man anymore, right? He'd been on the campaign trail a while. He had good generals that could go out and do it. But God had called him to be a conqueror for Israel, right? And he decided to take a little bit of a break. He probably felt like he'd earned it. It probably didn't feel like a wrong choice. But what led him into, if he hadn't been in Jerusalem, he wouldn't have gotten in trouble, right? And so I think that idea here of being overtaken, this transgression, is one where most believers who get into sin don't plan to go into sin. Now, that doesn't excuse them, right? It doesn't mean that they don't realize that they're in sin, but most of them probably didn't mean to go that way in the first place. And so he says, you which are spiritual, restore such a one. Okay, well, what does spiritual mean? It means spiritually mature. And Galatians has a lot to say about what spiritual maturity looks like. It says to walk in the Spirit, be led by the Spirit, and keep in step with the Spirit. Like if you're spiritually mature, you're supposed to be doing this. Bottom line. And you say, well, how do I know if I'm supposed to do it? Well, I would say that if you encounter someone who is overtaken in a trespass, you're supposed to do it. Because that's what it says. To restore, this is important, because I think one of the things we struggle with, and when I say we, I mean that, because I know I do, right, is this idea of restoration. What does it mean? Right? And maybe we understand, we kind of have an understanding of where the goal of restoration, we think it probably should look like when we get there. Sometimes we aren't quite sure what the process is supposed to look like. Means to put to right, to make complete. Remember when the disciples were sitting repairing their nets and Jesus came by and said, come follow me? The word that is used there of repairing the nets, same word as restore. Right? And if you think about a net, right? And what they would do is the twine or the yarn or whatever they used would occasionally get broken. Fish have sharp fins and things like that, and so they'd get things, or maybe drag on the rocks on the bottom of the lake. And so they would have to go and they'd have to tie those pieces back together. Right? It's one piece at a time. It's a big part of their job. It took hours probably every day. And so this is really a good description of what this restoration kind of looks like, where you take someone who has fallen, is hurt, or whatever, and you seek to restore them. And it's not a one-time event. It's a process, often a very gentle process, right? Have you ever been to the doctor and you were hurt significantly, right? Like big old cut, and they're going to give you stitches, or broken something or ruptured something. You know what I mean? And there's that one nurse who recognizes you're in pain, and she figures, well, what's a little more, right? And so does this hurt? Yes, it hurts. Okay, does this hurt? Yes, it hurts. And there's the other one that's like, okay, now, and very, very gentle, right? And does that hurt? Yeah? Okay, all right. What about here? Yeah. But she's very, very gentle. And the two, you know the difference? Which do you want? Right? It took a little more effort probably for her to be a little more gentle, but I really appreciated it, right? Well, folks, when it comes to restoration, it needs to be gentle, right? That's where we get in this idea of humility. So he gives us two warnings, because restoration is not without its dangers to the person doing the restoration, right? And he actually gives us two warnings. First of all, he warns against pride, right? This is where considering yourselves lest you also be tempted. That spirit of gentleness. That's the King James uses the term meekness, right? There's this idea of humility, right? Considering yourself lest you also be tempted. It actually is what he's calling for, is self-reflection prior to engaging the person. Okay, why am I engaging them? Right? Do I have a log in my own eye? And they have this mote? Do I need some restoration? Do I need to get right with God first? Right? And some self-evaluation here, some humility, and even in coming them, it's this very gentle, humble spirit. Can I help? Right? These three guys that called me, they were very humble and very gentle. They didn't condemn me. They didn't talk down to me. Nothing. They just said, hey, we're praying for you. Can we be there? What do you need? So first he warns against this pride. One of the commentaries I looked at for gentleness said it is the quality of not being overly impressed by a sense of one's self-importance. Have any of you ever read the Screw Tape Letters or listened to them, a recording of them? If you haven't, you need to, all right? You can get them on Audible. It's like $5 or something on Audible. I will tell you, it is a phenomenal insight into human thinking and yielding to temptation. It is phenomenal. And it's by C.S. Lewis, the writer of the Chronicles of Narnia. It's really, really good. I actually was listening to it today on the way driving over from Des Moines, because I flew into Des Moines because that's where the conference starts tomorrow. And he talks about this in such a unique way, but not being too impressed by your own self-importance, right? And by the way, I encounter this a lot in the military, right? People get promoted, and sometimes they kind of forget forget where they came from, you know, and you can't you can't question anything. You can't say that's not a good idea, and it can get out of hand. And so there's this warning against pride, and it really starts with this idea of humility and gentleness. By the way, gentleness is found just a few verses earlier in chapter 5 in the fruit of the Spirit, which then ties you back to those which are spiritually mature, those who are walking in the Spirit, who are exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit. All right? And then he says, looking, to watch carefully, to guard against, to pay careful attention, to look out for. That's the idea there. All right? So as soon as you recognize God wants you to go help restore this person, you immediately need to be on the lookout, because you're probably going to encounter some attacks yourself. You're probably going to actually start to struggle with pride as you go to this person. Because if you start to see somebody growing spiritually because of your work, it's really easy to be like, yeah, that was me. Right? Look at the difference I made. And in a minute, we'll look at the perspective on that, because the verses 4 and 5, that's really what it looks like. But anyway, so that's the first warning that we're given, looking out. And then the second warning is that this could be a difficult process, right? He says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. He's just warning you that doing this is going to be a little bit challenging. You may feel it's a burden, right? It may be hard, probably will be at times. But what I find, I like irony. And so I found some irony in this, that in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, which I'm sure all of us know, come to me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. And so it's almost like Paul is saying, this is going to be a burden, but it's going to be a burden that Christ gives you, so it won't actually be that heavy. In other words, Christ will give you the strength you need to bear the burden for your brother. Because I think that's probably, at least for me, sometimes part of the problem is it's a little intimidating. sometimes when I look at these young soldiers and all the problems they have, right? Because often people won't come talk to the chaplain until they can't think of anybody else to talk to, right? And so by the time they come talk to the pastor or the chaplain or whoever, it's like their life is imploding, right? So by the way, if you're struggling a little bit, go talk to the pastor early, right? Just plug for pastor and my dad and Wes, right? So if you're struggling a little bit, go talk to him now. Don't wait until it gets really, really bad, because it's a lot harder to help fix it, okay? Kind of like medical problems. Ignoring them doesn't usually make them better, okay? I have a ruptured Achilles to prove it several years ago. But anyway, so maybe difficult part to bear, it means to carry. To use of Christ, it was used of Christ when he carried his cross, right? And I got to thinking about that a little bit, and this is just something of an analogy, but remember how Simon carried Christ's cross, was, commandeered to carry Christ's cross for him? To carry a cross was a very demeaning and embarrassing circumstance. Do you think that maybe helping someone else who's having maybe a real struggle, and maybe what they need from you is not worthy of your dignity as a mature Christian? Maybe it will be uncomfortable. Maybe people will misunderstand. Maybe it will be heartbreaking. We don't know. But it probably will not be naturally easy. It will take dependence on Christ. So, in verses 4 and 5, we have a couple of pitfalls. The pitfalls were in verses 1 and 2, and 3 through 5. We kind of have this cure, right, for how we're supposed to look at this. He says, let each one examine himself. Let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another, for each one shall bear his own load. So, really the cure is honest self-examination, right? Because you think about this, right? You look at what this says. It says, if anyone thinks that he is, but let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. Well, think about that biblically. If you examine your successes, the works you have done that are good, can you honestly take the credit for those? No, you can't. Right? Paul isn't saying, hey, make sure you've got all your ducks in a row and make sure that you can honestly say that you got your act together. Right? That's not what he's saying. What he's pointing out is indirectly pointing out, you're not so hot yourself, okay? The way to stay humble is to recognize, well, you know what? How many times has someone restored you? What goodness can you take full what goodness of your own can you take full responsibility for? Do you have godly children? Do you have an intact home? Do you have a good job? Do you have a good church? Do you have a good understanding of biblical truth? Have you grown spiritually in your life after becoming a Christian? Hopefully. I hope all those are true. But why? Is it because you're such a great person, or is it because of God's grace and his mercy? Is it because perhaps others have taught you, restored you, strengthened you? How many times has someone else helped you bear your load? Right? See, that's the cure for this pride that can creep in when we are seeking to restore someone else, is to recognize how much others are responsible for whatever goodness we have. I wouldn't be where I am today. I wouldn't have the biblical knowledge I have, whatever spiritual maturity I have. I wouldn't have the job I have. I wouldn't have the education I have without my parents. without this church. And you, if you're honest, will have to say the same. There's no self-made Christians. Right? Sometimes, often we talk in business or whatever, he's a self-made man. Not in Christianity. Not in our walk with God. Got a couple questions just to close here. I'd like you to write these down. I would like you to discuss these, maybe with your spouse, maybe with some friends, Christian friends, maybe with your children. And these are for reflection, for thought. But first of all, what are some reasons, and I use the word we, but you could probably write I, don't seek to restore believers who are overtaken? Now, perhaps you do sometimes, right? And other times you don't, in which case you need to ask yourself, why? Why do we do it sometimes and not others? The second question is, what does restoring and bearing another person's burdens look like? I would say it probably doesn't look the same for everyone. So then, as God begins to work in your heart about perhaps helping restore someone, maybe you need to ask yourself that question before you jump in. What does restoring for this person, what does bearing their burden look like? So, and please don't laugh, but honestly, sometimes for my wife and I, it's taking someone a home-cooked meal. Right? The Lord just, hey, you need to do this. And so we've done it. And what we found, at least in the people that we interact with regularly, a real home-cooked meal, right? What I thought was normal growing up, especially in Iowa, right? Like a good, solid home-cooked meal is unusual for most people today, especially in, like I said, our community. And so for you to take some grilled chicken and mashed potatoes and, some vegetables and some homemade rolls and maybe a homemade apple pie, like, that is a huge thing for them. It could be something that simple sometimes. Sometimes it's something that's a little more, takes more time. It's a little bit heavier. So, I don't have a real good conclusion tonight. Unfortunately, I found out I was preaching just a couple days ago, and between flying and some things with work and trying to travel today, this is not as polished as I would like it to be. But I guess my question is, who does God want you to restore? Because he doesn't say if. No, he does. He says if a brother. But he doesn't say if you notice. He just says restore him. Who does God want you to help restore? And what does that look like? Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for giving us our brothers in Christ, our church, and for the role that they play in our spiritual walk with you, in our growth, in our restoration. I pray that each of us would be led by your Spirit, that we would be spiritual, and they would restore those around us who are hurt, who have been overtaken. And Lord, that you be glorified, and we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.